Well, today we're going to have fun examining the best luxury wagons for 1974 because these vehicles were bought often by families that wanted to have expensive vehicles that were stylish, but, well, I guess they had quite a bit of kids or a larger family and wanted to carry some cargo. So unfortunately, if you wanted a top-of-the-line luxury car, you could obviously get a Lincoln, you could get an Imperial, you could get a Cadillac. But none of those brands offered a wagon in 1974, and so you were stuck going one down in the lineups to either Buick, Mercury, or Chrysler. So today we're going to talk about this estate wagon from Buick and the Colony Park as well as the Town and Country, and then you get to vote in the comments section with what you think would be the best wagon. Let's start with this Buick estate wagon for 1974. Now, in 1974, this estate wagon was kind of partway through its overall journey, and this generation would run from 1971 through 1976. So you had a few more model years after 1974, but 1974 had a number of new features. The front end was new. The estate wagon had these 4 round headlamps. Remember, this is the time frame during which the automakers were transitioning to the rectangular headlights. So you have a bit of a hybrid here. You kind of have the square style pod that surrounds a round headlight. And for 1975, the Electra would go to the square headlights. So I think the designers are trying to walk customers into that styling. You also have this revised kind of minimalist grille with the egg crate texture, similar to what we've discussed before, because egg crate means luxury. You went on the uppermost trims, and you often found that whether it was on a Cadillac, a Buick, or an Oldsmobile in the General Motors stable. Then from a design standpoint, you have this surface that basically comes from the hood and then wraps around the side of the vehicle and then creates this diving line as it moves rearward. Now, that was something that Buick had done for many years, even back into the 1960s, although it was more of a swage line S-curve back then. And by this point, for whatever reason, Buick designers had gotten away from that swage curve, but kept the diving line on the side. Now, one other thing that you'll notice here is obviously the fake wood paneling. And by the way, this is going to be ubiquitous across the models and the upper-end wagons for 1974. For whatever reason, automakers thought that you had to have the fake wood paneling on the most expensive wagons during this time frame. Well, because, of course, there were the woody wagons, the real wood wagons from years past, and I guess they thought that customers still liked it. You have to remember, back in 1974, a lot of people who bought those woody wagons were still around and buying vehicles like this. Before we move on to another photo of this vehicle, notice the little hump in the roof, and that provided some extra space for the rear passengers in the seat that was actually forward-facing in these wagons, which was an interesting philosophy that GM had during the time. Most wagons would not face forward in that third row seat, but you did have that on these clamshell wagons like this Buick estate wagon. Now, as we rotate to the side, you'll notice that diving line that I was mentioning before. The interesting thing here is that the wood trim also kind of has the top of it diving similarly, but on a little bit different. It's not quite a parallel line path with that upper surface. So I guess it's curious to me why the designers didn't want to have both of those perhaps on a parallel path. But well, they selected it, and they're designers, and I'm not. You also see the check in the belt here on the rear door, something that would be similar to the Buick sweep spear that would appear on many different Buicks over the years. You can see that the rear window glass in these also doesn't go all the way down, interestingly. Something that would be a little bugaboo for a number of customers, but I suppose that Buick felt that it went down far enough. And that was something that was true even on the full-size four-door hardtops, as an example. The rear glass never completely went down. It was close, but it didn't go all the way down. At least you got a big wraparound piece of glass out back. And of course, because it's 1974, you have the big bumpers front and rear for the impact standards, and you have the 4 portholes or ventiports on the hood, denoting that this is an upper end Buick and beautiful road wheels. And as we rotate along to the rear three-quarter view, you can see the clamshell, and here you have the top part of the glass that is retracted into the roof. The glass would go up into the roof, and then that tailgate section would go down. There was no way to swing it out. This was not a three-way tailgate like Ford had, where you could kind of put it down as a tailgate or you could swing it as a door. Here, it only operated in one way, and that was that the glass would go into the roof and that tailgate portion would drop below the bumper. So it was an interesting idea, but many people didn't care for it. You notice how slanted that piece of glass is above the tailgate. And so if you were loading your groceries in or something in the rain, they would all get wet because the roof was not covering them. That was done probably for airflow management to help clear the back window. There was no rear wiper on these. You'll notice air deflectors as an example on the Colony Park to deflect some air onto that back window to help clear it in the event of rain. That was not something that the Buick had. I also will point out an interesting styling feature here, and that is the little fins almost. Now, there's not vertical tail lamps clearly on this Buick, but the Electra for many years had this vertical style queue out back to help people remember that this was an upper-end car, and it kind of candidly robbed that queue from Cadillac. But it's interesting that Buick tried to incorporate it here into the wagon, and I don't know if it was totally successful, but that was the purpose for that design queue. Now, inside your Electra estate wagon, you did get some very comfortable seats here that were covered in vinyl, and you'll notice the big center armrest and the divided bench seat. GM had this philosophy, I guess, of having one fat armrest as opposed to multiple smaller armrests or two individual armrests for the driver and passenger, one each, and that was what the competitors would employ. Here you had to share your armrest, but you got a fat one, and I suppose that might have been better if there were no passenger, and there's always going to be a driver, clearly. But if there were no passenger, the driver could spread out their arm across this entire full-width armrest. A comfortable place to be overall. And when you were seated in the driver's seat, you did get to sit behind this driver-centric instrument panel that kind of wrapped around the driver. This was something that all the General Motors full-size cars would have when the vehicles were introduced for 1971, except the Chevrolet. And Buick here continued to keep this. Notice that by this point they had transitioned, though, instead of having a white numerals on a black background speedometer, this black numerals on a silver background was kind of en vogue for very briefly, like a model year or two. Buick used it, Cadillac used it, not quite sure why. I suspect they went away from it because it was harder to read, particularly at night, but maybe it looked cool. Speaking of Cadillac, take a look at that steering wheel. While it's got the Buick Electra logo there in the middle, that was robbed from Cadillac. That was actually a Cadillac steering wheel from a few years prior. That was something that Buick would tend to do. They'd steal the Cadillac steering wheels of previous years. Not just this one, but other ones. And I don't know, Buick was really the only one to steal the Cadillac wheels. Oldsmobile had their own, and Pontiac had their own, Chevrolet had their own. But Buick, I guess, just thought, well, we'll just take the trickle-down wheel from Cadillac. And here, by the way, is the third row seat that I was previously mentioning in the clamshell. Notice you face forward, and you're kind of sitting over top of the axle with your feet in the pit in between the axle and the rear seat area here. It was an okay place. Notice the padding isn't that great, though. So you're sitting a little upright, not on great padding, but at least you get to face forward, and that would be a big plus for me. I never liked the rear-facing seats or even the sideways-facing seats that the Ford wagons had. Now, under hood in your estate wagon was the largest standard V8 that you could get in these luxury wagons. That was Buick's 455 cubic inch 4-barrel V8, making 210 net horsepower. By this point, obviously the power was, well, not all that great, but they still had good torque. And Buick, by this point, wasn't making a 400 cubic inch V8, and I wonder if that's why this engine was standard. We'll see on the Mercury Colony Park, you could get a 460, but the standard engine was a 400 cubic inch 2-barrel engine, and in the Chrysler Town & Country, you got the 440 standard topped by a 4-barrel carburetor. Buick also had this interesting thing of this clear plastic radiator, which had various attachments for the coolant bottle and the washer fluid associated with it. Not quite sure why they did that, but they did. Now, one other thing I should point out before we go on to the Mercury is that when you got the Buick, you got a 127-inch wheelbase wagon. You got the long wheelbase wagon that was the same as the Electra, And, well, that wasn't always true. This was the longest wheelbase of any of the wagons that we're going to talk about today. So if you got the Buick, you got a little bit more wheelbase as well. Now let's shift gears and talk about the Mercury Colony Park for 1974. Now, of these three, this is the only wagon that had the hidden headlamps, and that's one of the things that I love about it. Ford just had this affinity for hidden headlamps during this time period. And if you got the Mercury Colony Park, well, you got a good-looking front end. Of course, you do have the huge beefy bumper for the reasons that I mentioned before, but very masculine, authoritative front end with those creases on either side of the grille that kind of start at the corners of the hood and pull inward as they approach the front. Very similar to Lincoln. After all, this was the Lincoln Mercury division. And for 1974 and 1974 only, you get the Mercury block lettering that's spelled out in front and a beautiful texture within a texture grille, the rectangles within rectangles and divider bars within the rectangles. I just like this front end and find it to be quite authoritative. And you do have the stand-up hood ornament too, because, well, you have to have a sense of where you're pointing this big land yacht. Now, we did mention the Buick had the faux wood grain on the sides. The Mercury has even more faux wood grain all the way up to the top of that bright work molding that basically separates the top of the door or the outer edge of the door from the inner edge and leaves you this little shoulder that's painted. That was a cue that went all the way back to the 1961 Continental and the Continental roof that was introduced on that car. Now, as we transition to the side, you can see just how much wood grain you got on your Colony Park wagon. One other thing I will point out that's really bizarre is this car does have door edge guards, but they're humorously painted or in the same style of the wood grain, so you don't notice them. It's kind of the only time I've ever seen that on any car. The door edge guards aren't bright. They're actually here, let's say, designed to blend into the wagon body side. So I thought that was an inventive feature that designers came up with. Clearly, you have this big body side molding running the length of the car to protect it from dents and dings. And of course, that was one thing that wagon owners really wanted, particularly luxury wagon owners, was their car not to get damaged or dinged. And often that's why you see these big body side moldings that are anathema to designers because they think they take away from the look of the car, and they do. But the customers wanted them for the reasons that I mentioned. And I do like the fact that you got the wood grain here kind of pinched between the color, this beautiful copper metallic color on the bottom as well as the top of the wagon. The other thing I will point out here is take a look at the wheelbase, and you'll notice it looks a little short, and that's because it is. This, as opposed to the Buick Electra Estate wagon, which rode atop 127-inch wheelbase, this rides atop only 121-inch wheelbase. So you got shortchanged when you got the Mercury wagon. You got the Ford LTD wheelbase, despite the fact that you're paying for the Mercury, which normally rode atop 124-inch wheelbase. So for that reason, while these wagons are big, believe it or not, the two-door Mercury Marquis Coupe is actually longer than this station wagon, because the station wagon has a shorter wheelbase. So kind of a strange tidbit, but a true one. Before we rotate around to the back, I thought I would just show one more picture of this wagon kind of in the golden hour, because it really is a time when this copper comes alive, this copper metallic. And I think it's just, again, a very handsome wagon. This might have been my choice. I'm going to spill the beans a little bit of if I were picking wagons back in 1974. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. Now, out back, you got these huge tail lamps, vertical tail lamps on either side, and more wood grain in the middle of the wagon. And, of course, the Mercury block lettering out back, just the same as you had up front. I mentioned before you see the air deflector, or that air dam, on top of the wagon here to help deflect the air over the rear window and clear it in the event of rain. Lots of bright work moldings and bright work trim on this vehicle as well. And you can see on the passenger side here, below where it says Colony Park and near the exhaust pipe, the spare tire hump. That's the spare tire well and where the spare tire sits. Now, this is probably why I would have bought the Colony Park. This particular model has the luxury trim option, which effectively gave you the Marquis Brougham seats, but in a different style of seat covering than what was in the Marquis Brougham. You have these vinyl inserts but the rest of it is what Ford called polyknit vinyl on the Mercurys or Duraweave on the Fords. It looks like cloth, but it's actually like a woven plastic, synthetic material. And it's a little bit scratchy, I have to say, but oh my goodness, does it wear like iron? And if you get, let's say, something that potentially stains it, it doesn't. It just wipes right off. It's a wonderful fabric, and these seats are supremely comfortable. Notice the split armrest up front, and the other thing that you'll see, perhaps a little bit better in some other pictures, is the carpet in this car is super plush and rich, just like the Marquis Brougham. Now, there was actually an even higher interior decor option. You could basically get the Grand Marquis interior in your Colony Park as well. This was the inaugural year for the Grand Marquis. It was just an interior trim. It was not a vehicle, but you could get it in your Marquis Coupe sedan, or you could get that interior also in your Colony Park. Here you can see a little bit better the carpet in this photo, and notice the rear seat, while it's comfortable, it doesn't quite have the legroom as the other Buick had, and that's because, as I mentioned, the wheelbase here is shorter. It's not bad, but it is a little bit tighter. And here you can see Ford's famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, sideways facing third row seat. Now, this is really debatable. What do you want? Do you want the sideways facing, the rear facing, the front facing? I have a feeling that that was part of the determining factor in terms of what people bought. A lot of the Ford buyers love the sideways facing seat. It's okay. It's better for me than the rear-facing seat. Not as good as the forward-facing seat, but this is what you got on the Fords. Now, under hood in your Colony Park, as I mentioned before, you got the choice of two engines, this 400 cubic inch 2 Venturi V8, or an optional 460 cubic inch 4 Venturi or 4-barrel V8. The interesting thing here was that the 400 made 170 horsepower, the 460 made 195. Not much difference, but in the torque department, there was even less of a difference. The 400 made 330 pound-feet. 460 made 335, just 5 more pound-feet with 60 more cubic inches. So the 400 wasn't a bad engine, but you have to remember also that this was a time frame right after the OPEC oil embargo. And so some customers were selecting smaller engines, even in these wagons, to try to save a little bit on fuel economy. I will say my Colony Park has the 460, and I would say I get probably 11 to 12 miles per gallon with it. It definitely drinks the gas, whether on the freeway or around town. But you had your choice of engines in the Mercury. In the Buick and the Chrysler, you got a standard engine and one engine only. And now let's transition to the third of this trio, the Chrysler Town & Country for 1974. Now, I must confess, it was pretty hard to find pictures of a 1974 Town & Country. Of course, Chrysler sold the least amount of wagons, and, well, let's just say that they rusted faster than the other ones, and they were unibody, so they were used, abused, thrown away, and I really can't even find hardly any pictures of a 74 Town & Country. They're pretty similar for the next few model years. There were some grille changes, so I'm going to show you pictures of a 77 Town & Country in a minute, and you'll notice that the grille texture is a little bit different, but yeah, the body is basically the same. Again, you have the wood grain here on the side, not as much as on the Mercury, but tastefully applied. And you have that little kind of step up in the rear around the luggage rack to give a little bit more rear seat headroom as well, similar to what you saw on the GM wagons. Now, the Town & Country was the only one of these wagons that was a unibody wagon that had torsion bar front suspension. The other ones had the Ford had a 4-coil suspension underneath. The General Motors Buick clamshell wagon had coil springs up front, leaf springs in back. The Chrysler had torsion bars up front, leaf springs out back. So it had the stiffest ride of any of these wagons. And also due to its unibody and Chrysler's, well, let's just say, desire to save money, I would say it has the least sound deadening of any of the wagons. For me, the Mercury and the Buick are very, very quiet. Both of them are similarly quiet. The Chrysler is noticeably noisier. Now, Outback entry in your wagon could be achieved through a number of means. One way was to swing the door out. By the way, all the Chrysler Town & Countries came standard with power glass that would drop down into the door, and you could enter that way. Notice the Chrysler had an interesting approach here. They gave you in addition to the foot pads in the bumper, they gave you a little kind of assist handle that you could pull from either side to get in. And you could swing the door out, you could drop it down and enter into the rear of the wagon. Now, in the rear of the wagons, as opposed to the GM, which had a forward-facing seat, the Ford, which had a sideways-facing seat, the Chrysler had a rear-facing seat. Ugh, my least favorite of all of them. But that was what Chrysler employed on their Town & Country. And, some people like it. It wasn't necessarily my favorite, but that is what you got. The other thing I will say about the Town & Country is you did get a little bit more room on the inside, at least for the second row seat, because these ride atop 124-inch wheelbase. Remember, the Ford is 121, and the shortest, the GM, was 127. Now, the front seat was a decent place to be. You got the split bench up here. There are dual armrests, just like the Ford, unlike the GM, so you can keep your own armrest. Chrysler also had, or this particular one, has a optional passenger reclining seat. You could get a passenger recliner in the Ford as well. I don't believe on GM you could get an optional passenger seat recliner. But if you wanted that, and I can imagine it made sense for long trips, well, you could get that in the Ford or the Mercury wagon as well as the Chrysler. And you did have this interesting center glove box that was in these Town & Countries as opposed to over on the passenger side. That way it was accessible for either the driver or the passenger. Now, under hood in your Town & Country, you got the standard 440 cubic inch V8 that made the most horsepower of any of the engines offered here, 230 net horsepower. So if you wanted the hot one, you got the Chrysler. The other thing that was great about the Chrysler was, in spite of the fact that it was unibody, it could tow 7,000 pounds. I mean, that's kind of like, I'll call it pickup truck territory, but you could tow that with your wagon, and I guess just don't hook anything more than that, or you're going to stretch the wagon and pull it apart because there's not a full frame underneath. But the 440 in these was quite pleasant. This is before the lean burn system would come into the Chryslers, and, well, that would just wreck the power and also the regular drivability. But here you just have the standard 440 with a Carter thermoquad carburetor. Interestingly, the carburetor body was plastic on those. Yes, I said that right, plastic. And the thought was that would help dissipate heat and prevent vapor lock. Instead, it kind of ended up warping over time and leaking and having various issues. But hey, it was the 70s and engineering wasn't perfect. So you can just dump another Carter thermoquad on, or an Edelbrock or a Holley at this point. All right, so which of these is your pick? Well, for me, it would have to be the Colony Park. And that's because I think the interior was the most comfortable. I definitely don't want the rear-facing seat. It's a very quiet and supple ride, very smooth ride. The only one, as I mentioned, with 4-coil suspension, which probably wasn't that great if you were towing something. The leaf springs out back on the Chrysler and the GM would help minimize the deflection. But if you're just riding around in your old, let's say, wagon here with regular old passengers, well, this is going to do you quite well, I think. Of course, you got Ford's dual-action tailgate out back. And, it just was a great wagon. I would probably, like I said, have picked this one. I love the front end as well. But which one would you have picked? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.